The first video that I ever posted on YouTube was back in February, and it was a January reading wrap up where I talked about all of the books that I had read in January of this year. I think I had exactly 2 subscribers at the time. One of them was probably my husband, and the other one was probably me from a different account. And the video got 18 views in the first 48 hours. And honestly, I was completely fine with that. I didn't post it because I wanted to get views. I posted it because I just wanted a creative outlet. I was already talking about all the books that I would read in a month to my friends and my family, and I would give them the exact same spiel that I've been giving here on YouTube. My husband one day just suggested that I start filming it just because I'm doing it anyway, and that could be kind of fun. I also watch a lot of booktube and YouTube people that talk about books. It's very fun for me. It's very relaxing for me. I like to put it on in the background and just listen sort of like a podcast. And I did notice that a lot of people that were just joining booktube would do something called a booktube newbie tag. I never wanted to do this tag because honestly, it's more framed as a get to know you for viewers, and I didn't have any viewers, so I didn't think it was necessary. But now that there are more people watching, I thought it could be fun to do a little get to know you booktube newbie tag, talk about my favorite books that I don't usually get to talk about because most of the time I'm addressing books that I've recently read, but there are a lot of books that I've read years ago or reread that really have shaped who I am as a reader, and this kind of gives me a good opportunity to talk about them. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get into it. As I was going through all of these questions and prompts, I realized that one, there's gonna be some questions where I wanna talk about multiple books. It's just physically impossible for me to pick a single book for a single question. And two, I didn't wanna repeat any books, even though a lot of the books that I'm going to talk about could very easily fit into a lot of different questions and categories for me. But I was strong and I did not repeat a single book on this list by the grace of God. Let's get into it with our first question, which is, what are the books that got you into reading? And I have a couple that came to mind, but it's also sort of separated by years of my life. I think that I really started reading as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, but I also had in my teenage years a bit of a resurgence where I recaptured a love of reading and reading on my own. But I would say that the first book that got me into reading and really excited about it is The Lightning Thief, which is part of the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series by Rick Riordan. What is there to say about this one? This was kind of my Harry Potter, the way that kids grew up reading Harry Potter and they would be waiting for the next book to come out in the series. I had that with Percy Jackson, actually, and I have very vivid memories of going to Borders, not Barnes & Noble, and waiting for the next book. I think we were on a family vacation one time, and the book was coming out while we were in Florida on this family vacation, and I made my dad drive me to the bookstore so that I could get the book. I've reread it many times, as recently as a couple years ago, just because it has so much nostalgia for me. It's still funny, it's sweet, and I just enjoy it so much. But I would also throw Harry Potter into the mix. Even though I didn't read this super young, Harry Potter was kind of the next book after Percy Jackson where I realized, oh, there's more books that give me this feeling, because Percy Jackson was just so exciting and I was obsessed with it. And I didn't think that I would be able to capture that feeling in other books. But when I read Harry Potter, it matched that. And even though I don't have quite the same nostalgia as it, it was the first book series that kind of clicked in my brain. I could spend the rest of my life just reading books 24/7 and be completely happy. And as I got a little bit older, I did read The Hunger Games, and this was my first young adult book, and it was an absolute phenomenon when it first came out. I think it's very well deserved. It really defined a genre of books, I think, that dystopian young adult main female character that is kind of the chosen one vibes. And even though that's been done many times over, Hunger Games just still stands so tall. And this felt, when I was reading it, this was like, oh, I'm reading an adult book. Even though I wasn't reading an adult book, it felt like I had reached another level where I was reading something that was not just for kids. And then after Hunger Games, the same thing happened to me like Percy Jackson, where I needed to find something else that would give me the same feelings as Hunger Games gave me at the time. And so I read Divergent next, and at least for book number 1 in the series, I absolutely got that same feeling. And I even got it a little bit more because there's a lot more romance in the Divergent series than in the Hunger Games series, and I am a sucker for romance. The second and third book in this series, though, I didn't really like as much. I remember feeling really disappointed by that, which is the first time that I had known what I wanted to read, started reading something that I was excited about and thought that it was going to reach that threshold, and it just fell short. But I still think it's a great book and really important, and it's not quite at that level of Hunger Games, but it felt important enough for me to mention here. The next question is, what book genres do you read the most? What do you typically gravitate towards? And for me, that is across the board fantasy. I've always loved fantasy books, and I think it is because of Percy Jackson and that making such a big impact on me. I also really like romance, as I kind of previously mentioned. Even though I love romance, I only recently have started reading romance books. I would always try to find fantasy books that included a bit of romance in it, and recently I've started actually reading romance books, and they're just so great to be a palate cleanser. I don't always expect a lot out of romance books, but there's very specific times where I need to read something fast, something sweet and heartwarming, and something that I can just move on from really quickly, and romance has definitely done that for me. And then, of course, the next question is, what are the genres of books that you read the least? And that is mystery, thriller, and I would probably put sci-fi in there, although I have been trying to read more books in those genres recently. I need help. I want to read good mystery books, new good mystery books. I've read a lot of Agatha Christie, and I think she's great and very iconic and important, but there is part of me that wants to read more of like a contemporary mystery or thriller, and I've been trying to read new mystery books. I just keep getting really disappointed in the ending, and for some reason I continue to read them though, because the beginnings are always so interesting to me. The plot is set up expertly. The premise is interesting enough that I really want to continue reading, and then the ending just keeps letting me down. So if you have any suggestions on mystery books, thriller books, even kind of the psychological, creepy books in that genre that you love, please, please, please let me know, because I am desperate to try and branch out into those genres. The next question is, what is the book that you tell everybody is your favorite? If I'm being honest, I'm not sure if I could say that I have one favorite book, just because I am such a mood reader. And so if I'm reading something in the moment that's really, really capturing my attention, that could be my favorite at the time. But there is a book that I consistently go back to that I always tell people is my favorite, just because it's easiest that way, and that is Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. I read this for the first time, I think when I was 18. It was right when the movie came out. This author, Jonathan Safran Foer, has probably my favorite writing style of anybody that I've ever read. It's funny, it's poetic, it's very artistic. This book itself feels more like a work of art than even a piece of fiction. It's super emotional. I cried so hard at the end of it, and it really defined my opinions of literature in general and the fiction books that I like to read, and I just think it's such a well done book. So if you're looking for something that is really interesting, really unique, but also very heartfelt and emotional, I would highly recommend this one. And then kind of piggybacking off of that question is, what is a book that you have reread the most? As a disclaimer, I reread books a lot, chronically, some would say, because I get so emotionally attached to them that it's really, really hard for me to move on. So I reread books very regularly. Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, I have reread many, many, many times, but because I am not repeating books in each question, I'm going to answer The Night Circus. The Night Circus is one of my favorite books of all time. I couldn't decide if I wanted to put this in my favorite book spot and then Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close in the spot of what I've reread the most, but I ended up doing this one because I have gotten into a rhythm of reading this once a year around October, fall, the start of autumn, just because the vibes of this are so autumnal. It's just the best way to describe it, and it's beautifully written. This book is unlike anything that I have ever read, and it's magical. It takes place in a different time period, usually like late 1800s, early 1900s, and it's about a magical circus. If you have not read this already, highly, highly, highly recommend. But wait until October because it really just brings the whole picture together. The next question is, what is a book that everybody else loved and you didn't? I actually had to narrow this down to 3 books for this question, only because I want to illustrate a bit of a point. I think that there is a very significant hype culture that takes place on booktube and BookTok and Bookstagram that makes certain books go viral, and I'm not always sure that they should be going viral. I don't ever want to shame somebody for liking something that I don't like or judge somebody for liking a book that didn't really resonate with me. I do think that there's a level of books getting too hyped up on social media and then a lot of people being disappointed by it, and they're really just getting hyped up because of the algorithm. And that's why a lot of people are even getting book deals, is because their videos are going viral and then publishers feel pressured to give this person a book deal because they have a lot of eyes on them and they know they're gonna make money. That's a whole separate conversation that I don't really need to get into. But the disclaimer is, if you like these books, that's great. They personally were not for me for different reasons. From Blood and Ash is the first one. I actually finished this book and kind of liked it. It was fine. Everybody was freaking out about it. It was especially being recommended if you liked A Court of Thorns and Roses, and people didn't know what to read next, so everybody was like, read From Blood and Ash, read that series, because that is the next A Court of Thorns and Roses. I am one of those people that read A Court of Thorns and Roses and really wanted something similar to read after it, and I got sucked into that trap, and I got From Blood and Ash and I got the second book at the same time because the internet had convinced me that I was gonna like these books so much, so I just went ahead and bought the second book. I finished this book and it was kind of sitting mediocre for me, but I was committed to trying the second book. And the second book, I don't even remember the name, but the second book was not my favorite. I think that the writing style is a bit dramatic and sloppy. The characters are not likable and it was too spicy in my opinion. I think it took away from the overall plot to the point where I just didn't even know what was going on anymore. So the second book in the series, I DNF'd. The first book I read and it was fine, but the series as a whole, I am not a fan of. The next book that I want to mention is Powerless. I know that people love this book, and this is another one where I didn't really dislike this book. This is a debut author. This is her very first novel, and that is a huge deal to me. And I always try to give as much grace as possible to debut authors because this is a huge accomplishment. I just saw so many people saying that this was one of their favorite books of all time after reading it, and it was not necessarily that this book was bad. It was just that the internet got my expectations so high for it, and I was let down. I have the second book that came out recently, and I am like 12 pages in. I've really tried hard to read it and get through it, but I just know if I try to force myself to read it now, I am definitely not gonna like it. So I'm waiting until I'm kind of in the mood to try something like that. And then the last book is Light Lark by Alex Astor, which I think is kind of the poster child for TikTok books. I know this is a very controversial book as well. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people are really annoyed that Alex Astor got published at all. I'm not really gonna speak to that. I personally think that the writing style was a little too young for what I wanted to read at the time. It was a little bit cringy, and the story itself didn't feel well constructed. I have not read the second book. I don't plan to read the second book. I just know that this one was not necessarily something that I enjoyed. I hope I didn't really upset anybody with those opinions. I'm so sorry if I did. Please don't hate me. The next question is a book that definitely deserved the hype. So on the flip side of what I just talked about, I definitely think there are books that are very hyped up on the internet, and it's well deserved. And one of those books I've talked about a few times on this channel, and it's The Will of the Many. This book came out last year and it apparently blew up on BookTube and everybody really loved it. I read it kind of late in the game after it had been out for a while, but I adore this book. This is one of my favorite books that I've read this entire year. It is a true fantasy book. It's exciting, it's adventurous, it's such an interesting world and magic system. If you have any interest in Greek mythology or Roman mythology as well, this will definitely have something that you would like. I guess this goes back to me liking Percy Jackson. It was very exciting to have kind of a Greek-inspired fantasy book to read here. I really am just a creature of habit, it seems. The next question is kind of interesting, but it's a book that you read the fastest. To be honest, I read really fast. It is not uncommon for me if I have a free day to read an entire book in one sitting or an entire book in a day, but the reason that I chose An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson is because this was the first ever book that I read in a day. I think it took me 6 to 8 hours to finish it, and I remember finishing the book and being shocked that I read a single book in a day. It was very exciting to me. This is a really sweet fantasy book. Another one that I would say is perfect to read around fall and autumn because the whole thing kind of feels very autumnal. It's kind of a cozy fantasy vibe, but very interesting premise and plot, and a super easy and quick read. The next question is a book you think deserves more hype. I had so many books that I thought about including in this question, but for some reason I panic picked this one book that I read as a teenager. It's a young adult book, and I don't know why, but it's always been one of my favorite books and one of my favorite series. It's called The Traitor's Kiss by Erin Beatty. And I think the reason that I ultimately chose this is because I have literally never seen a single person talk about this book on the internet. Not one time. First of all, the cover is so pretty in my opinion, which is probably why I picked it up the first time that I did, but this is a loosely based Mulan retelling. I think the reason that I loved it so much is just because when I read it, it was so unique to me. I'd never read a fairy tale retelling before, and I still think this is one of the best ones. It is young adult, so it's a bit of a younger reading level, but it's just really, really enjoyable. I kind of associate it with the same type of book as the Lunar Chronicles, which is the Cinder and Winter and other fairy tale retellings, but they're in kind of a steampunky world, which is kind of cool. This feels similar where it's young adult, it's quick and easy, but it's just a really fun story that feels a bit familiar still. So I loved this whole series. I think I've read it twice, even as recently as a couple years ago. So highly recommend this one if you're looking for something like that. And if you've never heard of it, now you know. Next question. A book you usually recommend when asked for a recommendation. So I'm going to share 3 different books from 3 different genres just because I feel like I read everything. Even though I have genres that I gravitate towards, I read everything. And I know that my particular tastes don't always align with somebody else's particular taste, but I do have kind of an arsenal of books that I'm ready to recommend to somebody based on what they tell me that they like. If you are somebody that likes fiction or historical fiction, I usually recommend Everyone Brave is Forgiven. This is a World War II book, and it gets pretty heavy and emotional, but it's just beautifully written, and I love the historical setting. It takes place in London, and it follows these 3 characters that you get really, really attached to. And so I always recommend this if you're into kind of the historical fiction. If you like fantasy, I keep going back to A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This premise is so interesting to me, the magic system and the foundation of the world that it takes place in. It blew my mind the first time that I read it, and I really loved the characters. It's really exciting. It's also kind of dark, and it also felt a little bit like I had reached a new level in my reading. It wasn't the typical young adult fantasy I had been reading at the time. It was like, oh, this is made for adults. And I don't know why that was exciting to me, but this is so interesting. If you like any kind of fantasy at all, I feel like you would like this book. And then if you're just a fiction reader or contemporary fiction reader, I have to recommend The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This was a book of the month pick for me a couple of years ago, and it's not something that I would usually choose to read, but I just got the itch one day and decided that it could be interesting, and it was really, really good. It kept me hooked the whole time. You just feel so much compassion and empathy for Evelyn the entire way through, and you're just rooting for her to get her happy ending. It really puts a spotlight on Hollywood and that entire culture, and it's just written super, super well. So that would be a great one. Those are some of the recommendations that I give when people ask me to recommend a book. Next, a book that you thought you would hate that you ended up loving. If you have watched any of my recent videos, you know what I'm going to say. It's Happy Place by Emily Henry. I really thought that I would dislike this book just because it's a second chance romance, and I'm not typically into those, but this got me. This book is amazing and wonderful, and I love it so much. Yes, a book that made you cry. Once again, it is not difficult to make me cry in a book. I cry in a lot of books. I honestly had to just walk up to my bookshelf, close my eyes, and point, and the chances that I would land on a book that I had cried in were really, really high. But I ended up choosing The Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman. This book is so sad. I didn't realize that this book would be so sad, and I took it on a trip with my two best friends to Europe, and we were taking a train from Italy to Switzerland, and they were both asleep because we had been traveling and we were all tired. They were asleep, but I can't sleep while traveling, and so I was reading this book, and I had my headphones in, and I was thinking that it was just gonna, it's gonna be like a historical fiction. It might get a little sad, but not too bad. I sat on this train bawling my eyes out while my two friends were just sleeping peacefully next to me. This book wrecked me, so much so that after I finished it, I felt heavy. I felt like there was such an emotional weight on me, but in a way that was kind of satisfying because you just read something that was really, really good. The Light Between Oceans. The next question is, what is a book that you wish you could read again for the first time? And I'm going to say Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I know that there's a lot of people that do not like this book. There's also a lot of people that really like this book. I am saying this book as my pick because I read this book for the first time in one of my deepest reading slumps of all time. I literally had read a couple books that year, maybe one or two books in a year. And for me, that was really low. And I just had no motivation to read at the time. But I kept seeing things about Fourth Wing. And so I went to the bookstore and picked it up. I absolutely devoured this book. I freaked out over this book. I love this book because I associate it with the emotions that I was feeling while reading it, which was mostly, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be reading again. I'm so excited that I'm excited about reading again. It was just a great time. And I love it. I love the dragons. I love the fantasy. I love the characters. I love the romance. There's really not more that you could ask for. Is it a flawed book? Absolutely. But I don't care because it brought me a lot of joy and happiness. Although the second book was a disappointment. We won't get into that. Next question, a book that has your favorite characters in it. This was a really tough one for me because I am a character reader. I read books and I enjoy books based on the characters. The way that this question is phrased though, I didn't want to choose a book that had just one main character that I really liked. I wanted to think about books that had large ensembles of characters that I really enjoyed reading about. I ended up picking the Throne of Glass series just because this is one of my favorite ensembles of characters in a book that I've ever read. It's also one of the largest. There are so many characters in this book, so many. And I was excited about all of them and I connected with all of them, and it was like the Avengers coming together at the end of the series when they're all in the same place, and if somebody dies, it's just the most heartbreaking thing ever. This is a good character book. And then the next question is, what is a world you wish you could live in? And I'm going back to Sarah J. Maas here, and I'm gonna say A Court of Thorns and Roses, but not specifically book number 1, specifically book number 2, A Court of Mist and Fury. I love the fairy realm and the way that she describes it and the different courts, and Velaris itself. Who doesn't want to live in Velaris, honestly? Yeah, spoiler alert. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I didn't really want to start a YouTube channel, but my husband encouraged me to do it. I say encouraged, but really what I mean is he coerced me into doing it by offering me prizes if I reached a certain threshold. One of those prizes was if I reached 1,000 subscribers, my husband would read the first 3 books in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. And so, ladies and gentlemen, he is 155 pages in. We're currently on chapter 18, and when he finishes, he said he would do a video with me. So that's coming to a YouTube near you. Next question is, what is a book that could cure a reading slump? This is a hard one because when you're in a reading slump, there's really only one type of book that could cure your reading slump, and it's just the luck of the draw, what you pick up and you suddenly realize you're in the mood for. So it could be anything, and different people have different books that they gravitate towards. For me, when I'm in a reading slump, I usually gravitate towards romance just because I feel like I need to finish something as quickly as possible to jumpstart myself out of it. But something that I would recommend is The Martian by Andy Weir. I'm recommending this one just because it's funny and it's easy. It's a fast-paced read. I love the characters. I think his writing style is really unique and conversational. It doesn't necessarily feel like you are reading this intense, great prose. It kind of just feels like you are with the character as they're having this internal dialogue, and I think it's done really, really well. well. It's not very big, it's short, but it also has you on the edge of your seat the entire time. You're just waiting to see what happens and if this guy can ever get off Mars. So if you're in a reading slump, I think The Martian could help, but at the same time, who knows? Just keep trying books until one grabs your attention. It's just like throwing paint at the wall and hoping something sticks. But Godspeed to all of you that are currently in reading slumps, and hopefully something in this video catches your attention and might help you with that. The next question is, what is a book that you think everybody should read at least once in their life? I think you should read All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is also a World War II book, but it's got a little bit of magical realism thrown in there as well. The characters are really beautiful. His writing style is some of the most gorgeous prose I have ever read in any book. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner for this book. I don't know if that actually means a lot to some people, but if that convinces you to read it, then great, read this book. I think it's important. Next question is, what is a book that you think would make a great movie? This is an interesting one because there actually already is not a movie and not even a TV show, but these characters and this book is referenced in a TV show. And it is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This takes place in the Grishaverse, which actually originates in the book series Shadow and Bone. They made Shadow and Bone into a TV series, and they brought in the characters and some of the settings that you see in Six of Crows. But that TV series didn't do very well, and I don't think that they did a great job at capturing the books themselves. Definitely not Six of Crows. I actually haven't read Shadow and Bone. I've tried to read Shadow and Bone. I think I've tried to read that book 3 times, and the farthest I've gotten is 150 pages. I don't know why, I just can't get into it. Actually, I do know why. It's because it's a love triangle. I hate love triangles. So I haven't read Shadow and Bone, but Six of Crows, I love this duology, Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. I think the characters are so interesting. I think the setting is so interesting, and I really would love to see it brought to life in a movie or a TV show in a way that just focuses on them and is done really, really well. This is a good question. What is a book you wish everyone would give a shot, even if it's out of their comfort zone? The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This book is one of my favorites for sure. It's the same author, V.E. Schwab, that actually wrote A Darker Shade of Magic and the Conjuring of Magic series, which I didn't realize when I first read the book, but this is kind of an urban fantasy magical realism book. The ending of this book made me want to run through a wall afterwards. I was so hyped up and excited about it. I literally finished the book and went straight to my husband. I sat him down and I sat down across from him and I was like, let me tell you the entire plot of this book. And I sat there with him for 2 hours with the book open on my lap, and I went through the entire plot line. I read quotes, I told him everything that the characters do, I told him the ending, because I knew that he was never gonna read it, but I needed to be able to discuss this book with somebody. It was so important that I could have a conversation with somebody about the book that understood the story. My poor husband, he really puts up with a lot from me, but I think that this is outside of a lot of people's comfort zones because it is technically a fantasy, and some people just don't like fantasy, and that's totally fine. It doesn't really feel like a fantasy book in my opinion. I don't know what it feels like. It feels like it's in a genre entirely its own. I think that you should give this a shot. Okay, and the last question is, what is a book that you will never forget? This answer requires us to go back a little bit. It requires some exposition. So I was homeschooled. Both of my older brothers and I were homeschooled. My mom was our teacher, and we would go through schooling curriculum that assigned certain books for you to read in a year. And we had books that we would read ourselves, like Misty of Shinkotank, Squanto, Moccasin Trail, Red Sand, Blue Sky, Red Sails to Capri, Red Badge of Courage. But we also had the books that would be read-alouds. I don't know why there were those 2 different distinctions, but there were. So our basement is where we did all of our school, and it was an open concept where on one side of the basement we had our school table, this big wooden table. We had our whiteboards and all of our bookshelves with our stuff on it, and that's where we would do most of our schoolwork. But on the other side of the basement, there was kind of a living room setup. There were a couple couches and there was a fireplace, and that's usually where we would go when we were supposed to be doing our reading, or when my mom would be reading books out loud to us. Something about my mom is that she also loves reading. She was an amazing teacher to us. She was a first grade teacher for many years before she decided to homeschool us. And she also did theater in high school and college growing up, which is an important detail, because when she would read books to us out loud, she would do all of the voices. She would act things out. It would be the most engaging, animated thing ever. And it was always so exciting to me when it was read aloud time and mom would be reading us a book. So I remember this one time where my mom was reading a book out loud to one of my brothers who's a couple grades above me. And I was at my school table doing something stupid like multiplication timetables or something. And I would usually just kind of absentmindedly listen to her whenever she would read books out loud, but not a lot. I would mostly be focused on what I was doing. Except this one day, she started reading this book that I could not ignore. It was so difficult for me to focus on math or science at the time because my mom was over here reading this book that sounded absolutely insane that I wanted to read so badly. And I ended up leaving the table and going and sitting down and listening to the book that actually was part of my brother's curriculum, not mine at the time. And every time they would read that book, I would go and I finished it out with them. And after the book finished, I asked my mom, I was like, when do I get to read that book? When is that part of my schoolwork? And she said, I think it was like 2 years. I think I was in 3rd grade and you got to read it in 5th grade. And I was so upset that I had to wait to read this book. Literally, I had this goal in my mind, get to 5th grade and you can finally have mom read this book to you. Even though I had technically already listened to the whole story, I knew what happened. This is probably why I like rereading books so much now. It's because of this moment in my childhood where I needed to reread that book and rehear that story again. And I had to wait and it was devastating. But finally the day came and I got to 5th grade and I got to read Mara, Daughter of the Nile by Eloise Jarvis McGraw. I don't know if anybody out there has heard of this book or read this book before, but you can see just how weathered and worn. What the? This is so cool. Okay, this note just came out of this book from a time that I had lent this book to one of my friends. As an adult, I was a full-grown adult at this point, but I lent it to one of my friends and made her read it. And I'm gonna read this note out loud because it might convince you to read this book. It says, "Thank you so much for letting me share in your childhood and family memories by lending me Mara. I thoroughly enjoyed the story of a girl who wasn't afraid of stepping into new experiences and in the process falling in love with her land, her man, and herself." This book means so much to me. I've read this book so many times over the years. I've read this by myself. I have had my mom reread this book to me probably 3 or 4 times since I was in 5th grade. I think the last time I was like 16 years old. It really is a deep bonding point for us, this book. And my brothers loved this book when she would read it out loud. Even my dad would sometimes sit down and listen to her read this book. And it just is kind of a core memory for me, anything to do with Mara, Daughter of the Nile. And it's definitely something that I'm excited to share with other people. And also just I have this vision of reading it to my own kids one day. And so that is why this is a book that I will absolutely never forget. So, whew, that was so many books. I think we just talked about 25 books, all of different genres, all books that have been very significantly important to me and my reading journey. So I hope that there's something on this list that resonates with you and you're able to find something new and something that you really enjoy. So thank you for sticking through this entire monster of a video, and thank you for being even a little bit interested in my opinions and my recommendations. It means a lot, and we'll see you next time.